Good morning, and thank you everyone for being here. I am Holly Davis, Citrus County Commissioner, and I want to emphasize that today is not about politics or jurisdiction. The Lower Withlacoochee does not stop at a county line, and clean water is not a partisan or a local issue. It's a quality of life issue that impacts all of us. It fuels our economy, sustains our fisheries, supports recreation, and defines the character of our beautiful nature coast. But we've also seen a growing willingness to work together. The purpose of today's tour is to stand on the same ground, see the same conditions, and begin shaping a shared strategy for restoration. This is about collaboration, not blame, building partnerships that combine science, funding, and local knowledge to bring this river back to health. As we move through each stop today, I'd like us to keep one question in mind. What does success look like for the Lower Withlacoochee River 5, 10, or 20 years from now? We are starting here at the bypass channel, the lifeline that still connects this river to its headwaters, and see where the opportunities for recovery begin. The Inglis bypass channel was constructed in the early 1960s as a compensatory flow path from the Cross Florida Barge Canal, and it diverted the main stem of the Withlacoochee River into the canal system. This bypass now provides nearly all freshwater inflow to the Lower Withlacoochee. Its flow volume is controlled by a gated structure at the dam that determines how much water reaches the natural channel versus the Barge Canal. Southwest Florida Water Management District hydrologic monitoring shows that the bypass discharge frequently drops below 600 cubic feet per second, which is less than half the flow estimated to maintain natural circulation downstream. Enhancing flow through this channel is a core restoration opportunity. Greater discharge could revive aquatic vegetation, improve water clarity, and strengthen recreational and economic benefits for the lower river communities. The bypass is the lifeline of the Lower Withlacoochee. Restoring its flow is the first step towards restoring the river itself.
I'm Dr. Mark Fulkerson, a Chief Professional Engineer with the Southwest Florida Water Management District. All right, so we're currently here at the Inglis Bypass Spillway, and this is the primary discharge structure to release water from Lake Rousseau, and that water flows to the Lower Withlacoochee River, and really, whatever is flowing into Lake Rousseau from the Upper Withlacoochee River, we let out through this structure, and it flows down the Lower Withlacoochee River. And you can see that water coming into the old Barge Canal. It goes down this bypass channel, and then it flows over the bypass spillway. And this bypass spillway handles all the water that's flowing into Lake Rousseau up to a certain point. It has a maximum capacity of about 1,400 cubic feet per second. That's about 900 million gallons a day. And most of the time, that's all that's flowing down the Withlacoochee River. Most of the time, it's less than that. So under most circumstances, this structure handles all the water that's flowing into Lake Rousseau, and it's able to discharge it out down the Lower Withlacoochee River. There are instances, however, when we get more flow than 1,400 cubic feet per second in the Withlacoochee River coming into Lake Rousseau. And when that occurs, when this bypass spillway reaches its capacity, when it's maxed out, we have to open up the Inglis Main Dam. And this Inglis Main Dam, it's really our secondary discharge point from Lake Rousseau. When that Inglis bypass spillway is maxed out, we'll open up this Inglis Main Dam. We're trying to typically hold a constant water level on Lake Rousseau, and so we're matching the incoming flows, and we're sending that same amount out of Lake Rousseau. And so when the bypass spillway reaches capacity and goes beyond that, we're going to open up this Inglis Main Dam. They're going to flow through this about a mile of the old Withlacoochee River channel. You can see it can't connect anymore to the Lower Withlacoochee, so it enters the Barge Canal and then goes out into the Gulf of America.
I'm Helen Cialella. I owned a business in Yankeetown for about 25 years, and marina right on the Lower Withlacoochee. And I've watched storms, and I've watched all kinds of things happen, and I've watched war spend hours and years and trying to get this thing done. Various other folks around the community and in the county try to get it done, and this is a milestone today. and I am thrilled that Holly jumped on this. This has been a Tri-County issue since day one, and nobody's been paying much attention to it except for Levy off and on for the years. So this gives us some beef to get this thing moving forward. I haven't lived here as long as Lawrence or Isaac, but I watched the river deteriorate for 25 years, and it's very sad. The fish are gone, the grass is gone, it's a mess, and it needs to be dealt with pretty soon or we're just going to lose the whole thing. So I am very grateful that everybody's here and everybody's paying attention, and I specifically want to thank Holly and company for doing this for us because we need it. We need the help. So thank you.
So talking about flows, Commissioner Davis is exactly right. This is the primary discharge of water from Lake Rousseau to the Lower Withlacoochee River because of the altered configuration of the area. What comes out of the main Inglis Dam doesn't get to the Lower Withlacoochee River anymore, so this bypass allows the flow that leaves Rousseau to do that. Today, and really all year in 2025 pretty much, and probably until maybe next summer, all the water that's coming into Lake Rousseau is coming through this structure and coming down to Lower Withlacoochee. So this structure does have a capacity of realistically about 1,400 cubic feet per second, which is about 900 million gallons of water a day when that amount of flow is flowing upstream from the Withlacoochee River into Lake Rousseau. So when that's happening, we're able to max out this structure. When the structure gets maxed out, we do open up the Inglis main dam and discharge that excess water to the Barge Canal into the Gulf because that's the configuration. In 2025, it's going to be 100% of the time that every drop of water that comes into Lake Rousseau, besides what evaporates or leaks, is going to come down the Lower Withlacoochee River. The only time when it doesn't get those maximum flows are when this structure is maxed out, which is typically maybe a month a year, maybe 2 months a year, sometimes 0 days in a given year.
Hi, I'm Isaac Young. I'm Inglis mayor, lifelong resident. One of the main problems is the water that we are getting to our river is what we call surface water. We're not actually getting the spring water. We're getting the surface water because of the way that the canal is designed is off to the side. So the original flow comes down and mainly hits the Barge Canal and the Crystal River spillway. We call this the dam, us locals in Inglis. So it's different than the names that y'all give it. So back in around 71 is, I believe, when this canal was designed. From that point on, in my lifetime, this had become an estuary. There were baby flounders that were born up here. This was a hatchery. We used to come here and swim, and there would be millions of baby flounder here in the sand. They no longer exist. Our shad no longer exist. The jacks no longer are here. Even though about 2 years ago, me and some of my friends released some baby shad into our river to try to bring back some of the species that are no longer here. And we do have some jacks showing up this year, which is a good thing. Spring water is the number one thing that will allow shad to lay their eggs and swim in a river. And we have too much saltwater intrusion. So the design pattern of this, I don't believe will work because of the location of the water that we're getting is off to the side of Lake Rousseau. And if you look at a sky map, you can see that. So I've swam every inch of this river more times than people have looked at it. I know the bottom of that river better than I know the top of it. I know where every spring is. I know where the grass was at and where it's not at. We no longer have very many bass in our river like we used to. The other issue with that is because that spring water is being pushed out the Barge Canal, a lot of them species are being pushed out that Barge Canal as well because they're following the spring water. Well, there's a lot of silt in some areas and some areas not. Because what it is that surface water that we're getting from Lake Rousseau, after they spray, it comes this way. So all that surface spray that Fish and Game or whoever sprays the state to kill the grass, it comes here, and then it settles down as it's going down our river. And it's also killing our oyster beds. We used to have oyster bars, and the bars are still there. You can pull up Google Map, and you can see bars that run roughly about 1 mile to 2 miles long on each side of our river and the Barge Canal, and they are dead. And when I was a kid, we used to pick up 5-gallon buckets. We'd take a 5-gallon bucket and sit it down, fill that bucket up without ever getting off of it. Now, there were more oystermen back then than there are now. So, you know, some people say, oh, well, you know, there's a lot of oystermen here. There was a whole lot more back then than there are now. And that fresh water is the lifeline to our river and our resource. Not just that, but them outside bars. And you can pull up the sky map. In between the spoil banks and the intake side, there's a long shelf that runs that way that almost connects. That's how long it is. Them bars are completely gone. It's just dooms. Them bars also protected storm surge for our area. So this is a big issue. And I don't know how you can fix it by making this canal wider or deeper because of the layout of where we take that water in from Lake Russo. That has to change first.
Now we're at the Inglis Lock inside of this barge canal that was constructed in the 1960s. And on the upstream side of this lock is the water level of Lake Russo. And so it's about 26 to 27 feet higher than the water on the downstream side of the lock, which on the downstream side, this is just the barge canal. So this is the seawater from the Gulf that backs all the way up to this lock in the barge canal. And remember, this is the lock that was constructed back in the 1960s when they were trying to create a way to get barges and other boats across the state of Florida easier. Now this lock did operate for a handful of decades, and really it was just operated so that recreational vessels could pass from Lake Russo, which is on the upstream side, the right-hand side here. They could pass through the lock, down out the barge canal, and then get into the Gulf of America. This lock has not been operational really since the late 1990s. It kind of fell into disrepair. So it's there, it's holding the upstream water level in Lake Russo separate from the ocean level, which is in the barge canal, but it is not functional. It cannot allow boats to pass anymore.
We are at the Inglis Lock Recreation Area. The Inglis Lock and Dam form the primary control point separating freshwater Lake Russo from the Cross Florida Barge Canal and the Gulf of Mexico. When constructed, the dam permanently severed the river's original channel, forcing all downstream flow to depend on the bypass system that we were just viewing. The lock was added to allow boat passage between the lake and canal, but is now largely inoperable. The dam and lock represent both a constraint and an opportunity. Modernization or adaptive operation could restore more natural flow distribution without compromising flood control or navigation. This site highlights how infrastructure legacy decisions continue to shape the river's health and why interagency coordination is critical for any long-term restoration plan. The final thought here is that the lock and dam are the river's control valves, decades-old infrastructure still deciding how much life reaches the Lower Withlacoochee. As we travel to the next stop, which is Yankeetown Marina, we'll see how these upstream management choices ripple throughout the community, shaping both the ecology and the economy of the coast.
Isaac Young, Inglis Mayor, and this is my opinion, and it's not, if we're going to fix it and fix it the way that it should be, so the water quality is the way that it used to be, which is what should be done, it's kind of an easy solution, really, in my opinion. Me and a couple of my buddies with a couple D9s, we can get right back out there on both sides of the barge canal and push that same dirt that was in there back in there. And what I would do is I would backfill it for about 1/4 of a mile, and then on the other side I would build a smaller dam like this, then dig it back out and connect these rivers where we can still have the flow, where they flow back to the Withlacoochee River, and then you have the dam that's down the canal where you can let the excess water go for any kind of storm issue.
So we're actually at the site of the old Inglis Lock, so not the lock and dam. This is not where the Inglis Dam is. Just to be clear, this specifically is the Inglis Lock, which was part of the Cross Florida Barge Canal idea, right? Getting those barges from the Gulf to the Atlantic and back and forth, which they never completed. So this lock was used for a handful of years, for some decades, for basically people that just lived on Lake Russo to get out and fish out in the Gulf and vice versa, so they would lock through here. But definitely overkill from what it was originally intended for to what it was used for, and then now totally kind of decommissioned. Hasn't been operational since the 90s, I think 99, if some of you local folks remember. But think about 99, it was totally decommissioned. So it's just sitting here. So no water flow passes through here except for a little bit of the leakage. And Commissioner Davis mentioned a really important thing. She mentioned, that 100 cubic feet per second of leakage that does occur at the dam. So not where we are here, but over at the Inglis Dam around the corner and down a couple miles. And that is basically the product of an artificial embankment. So when they built and created Lake Rousseau back in 1909 originally with the original dam, and where we are here, we're holding back. We've got a water level difference in front of me to behind me of about 26 to 28 feet, tidal fluctuation difference. So pretty big difference. When you have an embankment, any kind of embankment that's ever built, Florida, anywhere in the US or the world, you're going to have leakage through the soils because of that. And so that's I think what the contention is, that leakage that's occurring because it's built up and you're holding 26 feet of water back to create the lake system that was created in 1909. You got that leakage. So how could you capture that extra 100 CFS and get it down the Lower Withlacoochee? And so going into what you had said, Isaac, in order to get any more flow to the Lower Withlacoochee, like substantial flow, we've looked at modeling the bypass channel. We've looked at the widening and the deepening. We drove over a box culvert when we came in, right when we came across that canal. That sucker's a constriction. So you can just look at all the water level drop when it's really flowing through there. We call it head loss in engineering terms, but it's the water surface drop from one side to the other because that energy is being dissipated and it can't flow through there fast enough. So that's a constriction point. But I don't think you're going to get a major improvement by doing much there. You'd have to do what Isaac talked about, which is reconnecting the river, but in doing so, and in doing it maybe in a way that we still provide the same amount of flood protection. It's more than maybe just you and a couple of your buddies pushing the dirt out and doing it. We probably have to construct another flood control structure there that we could regulate and say, okay, when we've got the Hurricane Milton coming down like we had last year, and if we want to get an extra 1,000 CFS because we can only get 1,400, how could you get another 1,000 CFS? Well, you can't get it through the bypass channel. You'd have to have a totally redone system here. So if you had another structure there, knocked out that dirt, built another structure, that we could allow some of those flood flows to go. You wouldn't want all of them to go though, because there are a lot of homes that weren't there, the docks and everything. We flew a helicopter over the old Withlacoochee River channel back here out of Lake Rousseau after Milton, and that velocity was unbelievable, just cranking through there and on those docks and on those properties. So you'd have to do that with a new structure there. Plus, you'd have to be able to block off the saltwater from coming in from the Barge Canal, right? And so that water didn't just go right out the Barge Canal if you're trying to divert it to the Lower Withlacoochee. So you'd have to build another structure there. And I think that's where that big cost come in. We did a study back in the early 2000s, multi-year study with URS Corporation. We did some additional studies, hydrodynamic modeling of the flows. How could we increase the flows? All those kinds of things. Spent a ton of money doing all those studies. And in the end, the cost benefit just wasn't there at the time when we were looking at those because of the times when that additional flow was available, which, like I said, is maybe a month or two out of the year. It's not all the time. We could spend $100 million and redo all those structures, and you wouldn't get any more flow down Lower Withlacoochee right now at all. But it would benefit during those high flow times to get that higher flush.
I'm Ursula Schwutke. I'm with the local nonprofit Withlacoochee Aquatic Restoration, or WAR. I wanted to touch on one point that I don't think has been made very clear. We talk about the maximum flow that we can get out of the Lower Withlacoochee regardless of how much flow is coming down the river, and that during times like this where the flows are naturally reduced, that we could go a year without getting more flow. But one of the really critical things for this river, which ties in with what Isaac was just saying, with what Mayor Young was just saying, is the peak scouring flows. And those flows that he's talking about, that I didn't even think about the impact of keeping out the storm surge, they also clean out the muck and the all of the junk from the herbicide causing the dying of the aquatic plants in the lake. And without that scouring flow, that peak scouring flow, that if we only get that, once a year, or probably even every other year, it's better than not getting it for 20 years. And that's really one of the key contributors to the dying of this river. So I just wanted to make sure that got mentioned.
Dave Huffman, also with WAR. Mark, you mentioned a lot of studies that had been done through time. Did any of them work on how much water it would require going down the river to keep the oaks and the cypress alive on the coastal islands, which are a big part of the buffer we need for storm protection? Those trees are all dying now and they're not being replaced. You go out there and you can find 6-foot diameter cypress logs, but there are no big cypress that are alive, and those that are slowly dying. What would it take in flow to keep that alive, which would keep our river alive, which would keep us alive in a hurricane?
There was one specific study that was done specifically addressing that, done by Janicki and Associates, and it was in 2006. And they did some modeling, and they looked at like the cypress tree die-off, and they looked at a period during like the 2000. Let's see. It might have been 2010 when the report came out. I can't remember, 2009, but they looked at like those drought periods. We had a real bad drought in the early 2000s, 2000, 2001. We had one in 2007 as well. And so what they attributed that tree die-off to was less available freshwater flow and the salinity in the river kind of over a longer period of time, where you go a couple years without really high flows, which unfortunately we could be in a situation this year because we're wet season, we're very low flow. If we don't get a lot of rain this winter, we could be in one of those severe droughts again next year by springtime or early summer. But they said, okay, how can we get more flow to keep that saltwater interface out that killed off the cypress trees, because we have a long period of very low flow coming down the Withlacoochee during those drought times. The conclusion to that study was, okay, even if we reconnected the river, made the Inglis Dam come through, it still is driven by what available flow is coming upstream, and that's based on rainfall. So when you need more flow to be able to push that salt water out, and during those drought conditions, under that specific circumstance, you can't manufacture more flow. It doesn't matter what you do with the structures, because it's just basically based on what's coming down the river flowing wise. You could, if you altered all the structures to get more flow, that would only be on the high flow during those high flow periods. But during those periods, there's naturally not an issue with that saltwater intrusion that killed off a lot of those large oaks and cypress things during those drought periods in the past. So that was their conclusion: is, hey, you want to get more flow, we can only do it when more flow is available downriver anyway. But when more flow is available downriver, you're already maxing out the flow in the Lower Withlacoochee, and it's not an issue. So it's how do you create it? And so one thing I've heard people talk about is well, what about all the water that you've stored in Lake Rousseau during those drought times? Just release excess water out, lower Lake Rousseau, release excess water out, and that will help get us through like the famine time, right? Those dry times. But there's different dynamics with that, and a lot of politics with folks that live on the lake, and how long that would last. And if you get into a period where you don't get any flow, now you've got a dry lake bed and no water flowing out here either. And of course, if this lake goes down a foot, it drastically cuts off what goes to Lower Withlacoochee, because the flow to Lower Withlacoochee is based on that level. That's why we keep that level. If we lower it a foot, you're going to go a large percentage of less flow, because it's just based on pressure head, right? Higher water upstream, this water level downstream, it can push more flow. If you lower what's available upstream, there's less flow that's going to come through.
Understood.
So there was a specific study that looked at that, and that was their conclusions on that.
Wetland Solutions came up with a 6,000 foot per second surge is required to keep the river as a scouring event occasionally, to keep it from shoaling up. In my short 15 years associated with this, I have seen the river losing depth in places. I've seen an accumulation of, call it pond scum, that is like all the way across and getting thicker. We're losing volume. Doesn't that make us more vulnerable to storm surge? our river's no longer able to carry the water that it should because it's not getting the water that it should.
Yeah, so one thing, Dave, we haven't even talked about yet too much is how the Lower Withlacoochee River was dredged. And so we've surveyed the whole river, mapped it out. The river, back when the phosphate boom, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and they dredged the entire Lower Withlacoochee River, that was probably maybe one of the most devastating environmental things that happened to Lower Withlacoochee River, in my estimation, from what I've looked at from the flows and velocities and all that. Because they pulled down maybe 10, 15 feet below what was naturally there. And then maybe only in the shallow spots, they hit bedrocks. They couldn't go any farther down. And so that's a big driver too. I think the velocities and the scouring, Ursula, that you talked about is you need a velocity. A velocity is a feet per second, okay? A flow is a cubic foot per second. So we have a flow, and with a certain flow, whether it's 1,400 cubic feet per second or 6,000, that's going to translate to a velocity, how fast the water can move based on the area that it can flow, okay? And so if naturally the river was, 4 to 10 feet deep, and now it's 20 feet deep in spots, now you've got much more area because they dredged it, and you can't get those velocities anymore. And so one thing that for a lot of years I speaking to the war group is, hey, if you really want to get those velocities, we've got to fill in the Lower Withlacoochee River, bring the bottom back to where it was naturally, and then with those flows, it's going to get those scouring velocities. So that's not anything that I think anyone wants. We don't want to shallow the river any more than it was.
Okay, we are at the Winding River Garden in Yankeetown, and this stop highlights how shoreline condition directly influences the water quality and clarity in the Lower Withlacoochee. A SwiftMud land use analysis documents widespread shoreline alteration, hardened seawalls, lawn conversion, and high dock density. Over 200 structures in some segments, which reduces natural filtration and resilience. FDEP data, 24 data, show that areas with greater impervious cover and less vegetation correspond to higher nutrient and turbidity readings, confirming the role of shoreline management in water clarity. The loss of submerged aquatic vegetation and native marsh plants diminishes habitat for juvenile fish, crabs, and birds while accelerating bank erosion. Restoring vegetative buffers and promoting living shorelines, those that slope down to the water naturally, while using native plants, oyster shell, and gentle slopes, can stabilize banks, filter runoff, and improve both ecosystem function and property values. This type of project is eligible for Resilient Florida and SwiftMud co-funding, especially when tied to flood resilience and habitat recovery objectives. And just for clarity purposes, I want to say that the folks who live here have informed me that this is an extremely low tide, a neap tide, but it's excellent because it exposes what everything looks like. We need questions, don't we? What zoning or incentive tools could Citrus and other counties adopt to encourage vegetative buffers and reduce further seawall expansion along the Lower River? How can local homeowner groups partner with state and district agencies on pilot living shoreline installations or septic system upgrades? In what ways can shoreline restoration be integrated with upstream flow improvements to achieve measurable water quality gains? And I can certainly speak to septic to sewer. We've done a tremendous amount of it in Citrus County, and we started with all of our waterfront properties and neighborhoods that were most directly. We've almost finished all of that, and oddly, we jumped to the center of the county and the neighborhood next to my neighborhood, and that was kind of a political football because they don't understand how their septic tanks are influencing the rivers, but the BMAP, the basin map, shows that they are one of the highest one of the higher contributors in that area, and it's a very dense neighborhood.
Dr. Chris Anastasio, Chief Water Quality Scientist for the Southwest Florida Water Management District. I just want to echo some of the comments that you made about living shorelines. This is true in many of our systems in Florida where we've seen a disconnection between the adjacent historical wetland, or in this case, the historical floodplain, and the river itself. There's no doubt, I'm a big fan of living shorelines. I think it's a great way to not only get water quality benefit, but also get benefit to the habitat value of any system. And one of the challenges, I think, and I am not, in the regulatory side of the district, and most of the regulatory pieces that are involved in living shorelines are within FDEP. But I think, in the work that we've done with our partners along our district, coastal areas, that's been one of the challenges that I think we've had with helping and working with members of the public. And there's a lot of people, residents and homeowners, that would love to see a living shoreline as opposed to just an artificial concrete wall. But I think there's some permitting challenges that need to be addressed in terms of the long-term maintenance, the long-term operation. If you sell your home and the new owner doesn't want a living shoreline, what does that mean? How does that work? So there's some of those details I think that need to be worked out, and then maybe that can be done at the state level, maybe it can be done at the local government level. But I think living shorelines is a great way for members of the public, especially those that are living on the river, to really help protect and improve the river. Sure. Yeah. So the question was about living shorelines and why they're important. What's the benefit of a living shoreline? And really there's two main benefits to living shorelines. One is just from the pure habitat standpoint. If you think about a concrete wall versus a shoreline that has native vegetation, it provides habitat not only for birds and land animals, but for fish as well. So it's a great habitat value. Yeah, fiddler crabs, exactly. Yeah, and even oysters. I mean, it's been shown. There's a lot of research that's been done by the University of Florida and others that have shown the benefit, the habitat value, but there's also water quality value. And, we talked about fertilizer. A lot of people like green lawns, and they do apply fertilizer on their yards. Well, that fertilizer runs off, especially if it hasn't rained in a while, and then you get a rain event, and that first flush sends all that directly into the adjacent water body. If you have a living shoreline, you've got plants that are there that act basically as a biological filter that can capture that high nutrient fertilizer before it enters the river. So it's really, you get two benefits out of living shorelines.
Ursula Schwutke with Withlacoochee Aquatic Restoration. 5 years ago, we had gotten the permits through FDEP to do a living shoreline restoration here on this part of the park and going all the way up into that little inlet area that you see there. And it wasn't that difficult a process. The project fell through not for lack of funding, but for political reasons. But we had worked successfully with FDEP to secure the permits and with FWC to get a full donation for all of the aquatic plants that would have thrived here, and we'd be delighted to help with that process again going forward.
And I said, in my life experience, I feel like it's not one magic bullet answer. It's a little bit from a lot of stuff. So we fix a little leak here, we do something here, we do something else here, and together all of those things make incremental improvements. We are here at the Yankeetown Marina, and it sits where the Lower Withlacoochee meets the Gulf, making it one of the most visible indicators of the river's overall health. This reach depends on steady freshwater inflow to balance salinity, flush nutrients, and sustain estuarine habitats that support recreational and commercial fisheries. Degraded water quality affects tourism, boating, and fishing, reducing marina traffic and nearby property values. Strengthening flow and reducing nutrient loading upstream are direct investment in Yankeetown's working waterfront and the Nature Coast recreation economy. So, final thoughts. Here at the marina, we see how upstream engineering and policy decisions show up in daily life. When the river runs clear, the businesses thrive and the coast prospers. And speaking as a commissioner, I sit on the board of Florida Association of Counties, and every single year I go to every single conference, and one of them is an innovation conference. And they pick a county somewhere in Florida which has done seriously legacy level forward-thinking stuff. And some of those projects, like we were up in the Pensacola last fall, and there was one that they showed a shoreline restoration project of planting very certain native vegetation that actually helped with storm surges and things like that, so hurricane protection. When I was in Cuba for a dive trip this summer, I saw the mangrove forests that they have there, which are hugely protective, and they actually showed like baby mangrove forests. So that's the kind of thinking that we need to bring to the river environment.
Dr. Chris Anastasio, I'm the Chief Water Quality Scientist for the Southwest Florida Water Management District. First of all, I want to thank you for this opportunity to come out here. It's always great to do this. Like Mark, I grew up on the Gulf Coast. I've been on this river more times than I can count. So, I appreciate the local perspective. It's really, really important. You guys know the rivers better than anybody. With respect to water quality, though, I think that's always a big concern. The thing to remember about water quality, though, is it's kind of one of those large terms. It depends on what you mean by water quality. It's kind of like if somebody asks you, are you in good health? Well, what does that really mean to you? The state does have standards. There are many of the water bodies around here that are considered impaired. I'll have to double check because my understanding is that this portion of the Lower Withlacoochee is not considered technically impaired for either nutrients or chlorophyll, but I'll double check on that.
This was an outstanding Florida
water. It is an
water.
outstanding Florida water. Absolutely, it is. But, when I think about the Lower Withlacoochee River, one of the things that I think of in terms of water clarity, and we've already touched on this, is clarity and salinity. And those two are really driving, I think, a lot of what you're seeing in terms of the benthic habitat and the changes that you're noticing here. And so that kind of flows, pun intended, nicely into the conversation that we've been having about flow and getting more fresh water into the lower river. So I do think that, water quality is a big issue throughout the state. It is an issue here too. But really, when I think about water quality in the Lower Withlacoochee, there's three things that I think of. I think of water clarity. I think of dissolved oxygen in the bottom, which is what fish use to breathe. Plants need it as well. And then just the salinity of the river itself. We talked a little bit about storm surge, about those saltwater wedges coming further upriver, further up than we've potentially ever seen in the past.
Sea level, right?
Sea level is definitely having an impact on that. And I think when we think about sea level rise about, let's say, 6 inches or so over the last 100 years, that's going to factor into the overall calculations that Mark was talking about how much water do you need to push that tidal wedge back towards the Gulf. And so those are all really important considerations.
We never had barnacles ever. Yep. The boats would come in, they get through the freshwater, nothing. About, I'm guessing, I'm pulling the number, but I'm going to say 10 years ago, all of a sudden all the pilings had barnacles. These guys were having to pull their boats and do all that stuff. If the flow was increased, would that get rid of some of that?
Yeah, Helen, that's a great question. And again, I think that comes back to salinity. This is a phenomenon we've seen in the Homosassa River. We're seeing it Crystal River, up and down the coast where you never saw barnacles. Now, all of a sudden, it's not only are you seeing them, but it's an issue. And so anything you can do to reduce the salinity in that upper portion of the river is going to help to reduce the impact of those barnacles. And just to give you guys a little bit of a very brief overview of when we talk about salinity, there's a range of salinity. So Gulf water, pure salt water, is about 35 parts per thousand. Freshwater obviously is 0. When you get around 3 parts per thousand, and the University of Florida has done a lot of research on this over the years, that's about the threshold when your more freshwater species of aquatic vegetation starts to they start to show signs of stress. And if that salinity goes much above 3 for a long time, those plants can't survive. Now, on the flip side of that, as those of you know, go offshore, we have a tremendous seagrass resource, about 580,000 acres of seagrass offshore. But seagrass, unlike these freshwater plants, need salt water to survive. And once your salinity gets down below about 17 to 15 parts per thousand, seagrass can't survive. So you end up in a situation where if you're in a part of the river where your salinity is anywhere between about 3 and 15 parts per thousand, it's too fresh for seagrass, too salty for freshwater vegetation. And so you're in this situation where the only thing that's really going to grow are going to be your algae. And so that's typically where we see the most algal biomass that starts to accumulate. And so just something to keep in mind. And those are all things that are factored into looking at what is the optimal flow, what is the best salinity regime. Obviously, up in the upper portion here, you want it to be as close to zero as possible so that you can have those freshwater, those historically freshwater species, Vallisneria, southern naiad, other species that are typically found in fresher water systems thrive. And of course, then that cascades up to a healthy fisheries and so on and so forth.
Hi, Isaac Young, English Mayor. I just want to touch base on a couple of things. First, I want to thank all y'all for coming out. This is a very important thing for us locals and our tourism. Our water quality in our river has been dying for years, and it's only getting worse. There's 3 issues. One is no one wants to financially pay to fix the river. The other issue is the people that are now have built $1 million homes on Lake Russo. But the fact of the matter is our river's dying, and it needs to be fixed. And that's the bottom line. That's why I'm here. I thank you for putting this on. And I thank everyone for their talking points. It sounds great. But the bottom line is the river needs to be fixed. And the only way to fix it is for us to get our water. We've been neglected with our spring water since this has happened, and our river's dying. Our industry for the commercial fishermen, the recreational fishermen are dying. Our tourism is dying because who wants to swim in that? I grew up diving turtles. When we'd get out of school, me and my buddies, and we'd go down to old Kelly Reynolds' house, and we'd get in John boats and canoes, and we would literally sink a canoe on the way down to Isaac Want Lodge with turtles, just for fun after school. And I won't swim in this water, and I will not allow my children to swim in this water. So the bottom line is we need the river fixed back, and that's it.
Really appreciate your time that you've taken to watch this video. Most of us moved to Florida. If we're not born here, we moved to Florida because it is so stunningly beautiful with all of our native habitats and wildlife. And we're humans. We make mistakes, and then it's up to the current humans to try to figure out how to fix those mistakes. And you're an important part of that. All of those things, it really comes down to each and every one of us truly believing in a Florida that is going to be even better tomorrow, and especially the Nature Coast, which is where we all live and love. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a perfect profile.